I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host Tanya Carwyn and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. This week we'll be talking about the folklore of the hearth, of stoves and ovens. But first, Tracy, what folkloring have you been doing this week?
Well, this week has been very interesting because I had a great conversation with my good friend Al Seeger over at Strange and Interesting podcast. And we were talking about all things liminal spaces, liminal times of the day. And in the meantime, like between then and now, I have been being mindful of liminal spaces, like walking through doorways and seeing if the energy feels different from one room to another, or how I feel in the dining room as opposed to the kitchen, and being at crossroads. And so that's been a really good exercise to just be mindful of that. So I've really enjoyed that this week. And also there are some negative liminal times, like the time between when I think I'm going to clean my kitchen and when I actually clean my kitchen. And but it's on my mind and it's taking up time and energy in that I need to do that. So that it was a really fun exercise. And then the other thing I did, this is going to sound really goofy. I realized that I created my own superstition. Yeah, when I first started taping, recording things on Zoom, I was recording everything in a single audio track. And that's not great because if there's a noise at one person's space and the other person is speaking, there's nothing you can do about that editing wise.
Right.
Or there is, but it doesn't sound as great. And so I struggled trying to figure out how to change the settings to do individual tracks for each person. And when I would set it and then it wouldn't do it. It would still be on a single track. And what I realized was I was trying to change it online and I needed to change it on my computer on the app. So I did that. And then the first time I was going to record, I was nervous. So I opened up the app and then I went online and started the meeting. And so I realized now that every single time I go to record anything, I always open up the app first and then go online, which is completely unnecessary. I still feel compelled to do it.
That's funny. Yeah, that's funny.
So anyway, what about you? What folkloring have you been doing?
Yeah, it's a good one actually, and by accident lines up completely with this episode that we're recording right now. My husband and I have been building an inglenook, and we will talk about inglenooks more further into the episode, but it's basically a seating area next to a hearth space. And so we heat our house with wood, and we live in a fixer-upper, and it's not quite fixed up yet. So basically, we haven't really had a place to put the wood inside the house, so we just go and get it from our woodshed by the armload full and put it kind of on the floor next to the stove, which creates a huge mess. And one of our dogs really likes to come and get a piece of firewood and chew on it all over the rug. So we really needed a space for wood storage in the winter. And we decided that we were going to build this wood box that sits kind of next to the hearth and then also under a window. And then we decided instead of that, we would also make a seat out of it so that it would be an inglenook, a seat right next to the hearth that has the secondary purpose of storing wood as well. And so when we decided that, we were like, okay, what wood would be appropriate? What color? And, we have some wood that we had milled years ago from trees from the land that had to come down. So we went and got some of that maple and have been piecing it all together. Building our inglenook together. It's been real fun.
That sounds amazing. And maple is such beautiful wood.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. We just found out though that apparently it's really hard to stain. So we're trying to figure that out, how we're gonna manage that. But it's gonna be amazing.
That is really very cool.
Yep.
And a great lead-in for our episode.
Yeah, exactly. So this week we're talking about hearths, the folklore and magic of hearths, stoves, and ovens. yeah, for us nowadays, those things are usually separate, right? Like I have a stove and an oven and a fireplace. Most
Right.
people at least have like a stove or so. A lot of people have ovens, and some people also have, fireplaces or wood burning stoves. We're putting them all together because they all originate from the one thing that was the hearth back in the long time ago. You had, and that was basically everything. Maybe there was a village bread oven as well, but originally everything was done around the hearth. And since it's one of those things that has been with people forever and ever, you can trace the etymology of the words back quite a bit and just in English, when we're talking about the word hearth, it comes from the Proto-Indo-European root kur or kera, which means heat or fire, which then turn into Old English as hearth, which refer to the floor of the fireplace more so than the fireplace itself. So like the place where the fire was, not so much the fire itself. Which is interesting because in our house we talk about the wood stove as the wood stove, but we talk about the space around it, like the slate tiles on the floor and the surround of the wood stove. We talk about that as the hearth. So I guess that still carries through.
Sure.
And then the etymology of the word stove also comes from Proto-Indo-European, and it comes from the root stehu, as I believe how you pronounce it. I'm definitely not fluent in Proto-European, but stehu, which means a stand or a support. So that basically means like the support of the fire. And then oven also goes back to Proto-Indo-European root of aug. That means to bake.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty common to refer to the area in front of and around the fireplace as the hearth,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
even when you're not using it for cooking or anything like that. I mean, I think that that's pretty common, at least where I'm from.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about, we're talking about the older ideas about it, and why was it important then? Why are stoves and ovens and hearths important now?
Yeah. Well, obviously, we are looking to the hearth and the stove and the oven for heating and cooking. And most of us need, I mean, pretty much all of us need a source of heat for cooking. And many of us also need a source of heat for just keeping the house warm. So that, I mean, and that goes back eons, right? People have always had that need pretty much. And because of the fact that it goes back so long and it's been with us for so very, very long, there is a lot of folklore associated with the hearth in pretty much every culture that I've been researching it in. The hearth is related to spiritual concepts. It is a conduit for spirit, basically.
Yeah, and I wonder to myself, because, when we're talking about people need the heat for cooking, there are people who only use the microwave. And I wonder if it is somewhat of a disconnection from spirit by not smelling those aromas as things are cooking and not, actually doing the stirring and the paying attention
Uh-huh.
and adding different things that personalize it for you. That seems like those things all connect me to spirit when I'm actually cooking. But I love cooking, so.
Well, I would venture to say that a microwave can't really be used for cooking. Like,
Right.
I think it can be used to heat something up.
But I'm saying there are people who don't cook. They
Yeah,
get, frozen meals or whatever
yeah,
they get. And for me, that it seems tragic because one of the reasons I love to cook is because for me, food is love,
yeah. Hmm.
That's sharing it is love. And cooking together is one of my favorite things to do in the world
Uh-huh.
because it's so much fun. And it doesn't matter the skill level that someone has,
Right.
because people tell me like, oh, I don't know how to cook. And it's like, perfect, come on in and I'll tell you what I know.
Right, exactly. For me, learning to so the kind of wood stove that we have also it can also be used as a cook stove. So for me, learning that, like learning to cook on my wood stove, like especially in the winter, and if it's going anyway, why would I use propane if
Right.
if the wood stove is already going? We always have a tea kettle going on it, so because we're always drinking tea in here. So, but yeah, that and then cooking over an open fire is a whole other experience, which is also just amazing and even more, in my opinion, like I, it's harder for me because I'm not nearly as practiced at it, but it's definitely more of a sense of like being present with what you're doing, you know?
Right. And I used to go camping all the time. I loved camping. I'm a little long in the tooth for that now. Uh, but I am looking at a place to go glamping. And cooking over the fire was part of the fun of camping because
Yep.
really the escapism for me is the only thing you have to worry about is what you're going to do in between the times that you're cooking and eating. It's like, am I going to go fishing? Am I going to go for a hike? I don't know, but it's sort of like your run on these times of like building the fire and cooking the food, and like that's the key activity. And then you just got to kind of fill in the blanks other than that.
Yeah. Which I think is a very human, the occupation that, like the thing that we should be doing as humans primarily is acquiring and preparing food,
Right,
not,
right,
sitting in cubicles.
right. Now, I mean, people like pretty things too, and that's a human thing. So, gathering those things and buying those things is very human
Oh, yeah.
in what we do. But yeah, and we've talked about this before. It's a matter of what's the trade-off. Are you going and working and sitting in an office where you can have one picture and no plant, or are you and that's from personal experience.
Oh, man.
um, yeah, and or are you? I brought in a plant anyway. I didn't care. Um, but yeah, or are you spending that time getting into nourishing yourself and your family and your friends?
Right.
And that's a big trade-off to me, and not one that I would ever be willing to make anymore. And I
Uh-huh.
spent years going to an office at, I'd get there at 7 in the morning. I'd be running to catch the last, the 7:30 commuter train out, and I was eating microwave meals, and I felt different. I felt less open.
Yeah.
But this is about stoves, not food.
I mean, it's also very linked, I think. So let's get into some of the things that stoves have been used for other than cooking. Interesting thing, specifically in Slavic countries, the stove there is of a supreme importance in the house. It's usually pretty big. It often has a bed on top, like it's
Right.
all brick worked in, and so there's a bed on top where the elderly people in the household maybe slept, or if you were sick, or maybe mom and dad slept there.
I heard that when I was doing the research, it pointed to that the man of the house would sleep there because it was the warmest spot, and so he got the best of the best, of course, and so that's where he would be.
That's so funny because in my experience, men always sleep hot.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And
But
it's and it's always
yeah,
me who needs the extra blanket.
yeah, but we're talking about Slavic culture,
Yeah.
and it gets cold there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, the interesting thing that I came across in the Slavic countries where the stove is diagonally across the room from what is called the red corner, which is like a sacred corner where often there's a shelf with an icon. These days, often a Catholic, or I guess that's a Russian Orthodox icon. But this goes back to pre-Christian times where there was the red corner, and red meaning like beautiful and sacred. And still to these days, they're usually draped, like it's usually a shelf that an icon sits on, and that shelf is then draped with hand embroidered like towels, and those are still full of pagan symbolism, which is really interesting. You should go and look those up. They're amazing.
Yeah, I had a friend who lived in Russia for a while, and
Uh-huh.
she brought me back some dish towels, and there was one for every day of the week. So they
Oh,
take these dish towels seriously.
yeah, for sure. Like when a woman gets married, she gets like a whole stack, I think, of them, and like the embroidery is absolutely amazing. So the stove is also considered a resting place. It's where if you're sick or if you're little or old, you get put by the stove. And there was, you see this in Celtic countries quite a bit, where there was like a kind of a nook built out of the house next to the stove where the bed would sit for the grandma and the grandpa.
Well, and as you get older, right, you're like the cold bothers you and bothers your joints and you feel it more intensely. So that makes total sense to me.
Yep. And I would also say it makes sense for the caregivers because you're right there where you can, make teas or warm, wet rags or things like that. Like it's easier to take care of people if you don't have to go run across the house from the fire to the sick or old person.
You can tell that you have kids and I don't.
Yep. Yeah. So we do it too here. And like sometimes when it gets really cold, like I think it was over last Christmas, my oldest daughter was home and it got really cold and we drug a big mattress out right in front of the fire in the living room. And the girls were just gonna sleep there that night. But then that mattress basically stayed there for the whole, like maybe next 2 days or so. And everybody was just like living on that mattress, which was awesome. We're all like sitting on the mattress by the fire with bowls of oatmeal and the dogs everywhere and the cat. It sounds like mayhem, but it was really fun. So there's also a role for stoves when it comes to childbirth and fertility. There's lots of different ways that people use the stove or the hearth area to increase fertility. And one thing I've even heard is of women sitting on the stove. One would assume only if it's not on or well insulated. And then, of course, childbirth happened by the stove for practical reasons, but also for spiritual ones.
Yeah, I mean, that warmth it's going to be a mess. So you're going to need to clean up and
right.
all of that. Yeah.
Go boil some water.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's also several parts of the hearth that are of importance in different ways. There's a concept of something called the golbets, which is also from Slavic culture, which is an area behind the stove, and it had special otherworldly significance. And that shows up in many different ways. One is that there's often the story or the thought that the house spirit lives there behind the stove. So the domovoi, the kikimora. We don't, like in Holland, we have the kabouters, but I have never heard of them living behind the stove. So also some cultures look at a house spirit as a snake, and the snake lives behind the stove. But then it turns out also lots of people just had a pet snake that lived behind the stove. That wasn't just a pet, but also had spiritual significance and also, of course, kept rodents at bay. But his place was behind the stove.
And it's warm. It would be warm there. So that makes sense for a snake.
Yes, exactly. And that kind of leads us into the whole idea of an inglenook, which is like basically a sitting area close to the fire. And they also believe that spirits and household deities would reside there, and they protect the home and its inhabitants. What I find specifically interesting is the word ingle. Like you can trace it back usually some Gaelic or Scottish word for fire, but then that word, the ingle, you can trace back to a Nordic deity called Ing, also known as Ingvi, which then goes back to a Hindu deity, a Vedic deity called Agni. And so you have the N and the G. If you're at all into linguistics, the N and the G often switch around in different languages. So from Agni, you go to Ing, which is a fire god. And so, yeah, the Inglenook still has that sense of like, this is where the fire god lives. And then another thing that's really interesting, I find in Holland and also I believe in Germany, you see the rune Ingwas often on chimneys, cemented in, like the bricks are laid, but then some of the bricks are laid so that they show that rune specifically for that reason. Like I think it's a protection and a invocation to that fire god, which is just amazing to me.
It doesn't surprise me that there's a lot of connection to the supernatural and gods and superstitions because fire is pretty
Right.
magical that way. And have the ability to have fire inside the home and have it be something that is nurturing and helpful and not destructive is important, and that is a certain kind of
Right,
magic, right?
exactly. And then you also see this thing as the chimney of the hearth, as the concept of seeing that as the axis mundi. So the center of the world, is different for all of us, right? And the idea of an
Yeah,
axis
yeah.
mundi in a landscape is pretty well established. But then also within everybody's home, the chimney, where the smoke goes out from your hearth, is considered the axis mundi of your world, of your family. And it's often considered that you can communicate with ancestors and spirits through the chimney, which is an interesting thing in Holland, where we celebrate Sinterklaas on December 5th, St. Nicholas Day. Children sing songs up the chimney because Sinterklaas and his helpers are sitting up there listening, which is just amazing.
Yeah, the chimney is a pretty magical kind of thing. I mean, it's an entry into the house, right? And there are so many magical connotations with it, right?
Uh-huh.
At one point believed that witches would, going off to meet with the devil, they'd fly up the
Right.
chimney and out.
Yep.
And Santa Claus, right, coming down the chimney. And in Irish and Scottish culture, there is something called the bodach,
Uh-huh.
and the is a shapeshifter that comes down the chimney to eat naughty children. And the pictures I found are really horrific. It's this sort of long, gangly, kind of humanesque creature that's dark and has these long claws. And so I think that there's a lot of magic associated with coming in and out of the chimney, and that being a not only an entrance, a magical entrance, but also I was talking earlier about liminal
Uh-huh.
spaces. The chimney is a
Yep.
space, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm reminded of something I read about Siberian shamanism, where, like, back in the day before they even had chimneys and it was just the smoke hole, supposedly the shamans would capture certain of, if somebody passed away and if they were considered a very good helper spirit, they would be captured for a time, and they would basically sit on the roof of the structure by the smoke hole to assist the shaman in his journeys, I guess.
Interesting. So we talked a little bit earlier about how, like, people sitting near the fire, and that there was a belief that stoves could heal, so sick people would be close to
Mm-hmm.
them. And the using steam for inhalation was believed to possess medicinal properties, which it does.
Right.
It helps clear you out, and so we still use that today. And I think that everything about the stove, even the stove ash, was not thrown away, but it was used to make ointments and things like that, and soap and bleach and mundane
Yep.
things. So it's just having the stove and all, it is just so central to people's lives.
Absolutely. And you see that especially, like, even going back very far in, this is Proto-Indo-European stuff, where you could not take possession of an area or a place or a house until you had lit the fire of the stove. Like, that was your,
Right, right.
even places where fire isn't 100% necessary. Like, I'm reminded of an interview I saw with an Aboriginal elder in Australia who was showing somebody how he made a throwing stick or so. And the very first thing he did is he made a fire. They're sitting out in the bush. It's totally warm. They're not cooking anything, but this is, and they asked him, why are we making a fire first? And he was like, well, we just have to establish that this is our place now.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, and I did find that in Slavic cultures, the first thing when they're designing a new home, they design the stove in the stove
Uh-huh.
area and
Yep.
then design around it. And there was a great expression I found that's called to dance from the stove,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that you begin at the beginning,
Yep.
right? And so I thought that was fun. And a couple of other proverbs I found. This one I like. If you keep lying on the stove, there will be no food in it. And if you want to eat rolls, don't lie on the stove.
Uh-huh.
So, we talked a lot about who gets to be by the stove and everything, but don't lie around on the stove too long.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's funny. So when we talk about stoves, we are also talking about fire, and people use the fire in their stoves as divination quite a bit. I found some references to the Banyoro tribe in Central Africa, who will refuse to hunt if their fire has gone overnight because it's seen as a bad omen. And in Dorset, in England, a smoldering fire that suddenly bursts into flames foretells a stranger's arrival, which is funny. That actually happened the other night. We had a fire and it was super late, like not super late. It was like 8 o'clock. But it felt pretty late. And all of a sudden a car drives into our driveway and it's dark around here at night. And right before that had happened, the fire had been pretty low because it wasn't super cold. We were just having a little fire and it was just doing its thing. And then all of a sudden there was like a big burst of flame, which, of course is, we have a catalytic combustor. And so every once in a while, it'll grab an extra pocket of gas or so and it'll flame up more. Anyway, it was just somebody dropping something off, which people don't really come by after dark here, unless that's prearranged. So that was interesting, and that happened right after I was doing research on this, and I was like,
Okay.
"Whoa, interesting." Some more divination with fire in East Anglia, also in Britain. People would spit on hot cinders to see if they crackled, and if they did, it meant good news and that money was coming on the way. If it
Okay.
didn't crackle, it foretold of death. So those kinds of things, like I'm always a little, I don't know if I need to know that so much. Like I don't want to run the risk of it not crackling.
So you have your own superstition.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty common on Facebook and stuff. I see all the time in different, supernatural and folklore groups that I'm in, people are posting pictures of a fire that they had and saying, "What do you see? What do you see in this?" And I think
Ah,
that, the way that the flame dances around is it's obviously it's very compelling, but I think that we do tend to want to look for images and shapes, and that's a very human thing too. And
sure.
so divination, it just seems like such a natural fit.
Plus, you're sitting around and you're looking, like your attention is just drawn to the fire.
Yes.
So, and then we're meaning making people, and surely after generations of watching things happen, you must just develop a system of divination based on this fire, right?
Right, right.
In Greece, for example, they looked at the behavior of logs in a fire as a method of divination. And again, if it crackles, that's good news, or a friend is coming. And if they don't crackle, it's not good. I think the behavior of logs and fire is considered good when it crackles and sputters gently, right? And
Right.
not if it's, and so all sorts of different meanings are attached to that.
Well, but doesn't a fire mostly crackle? So that seems like, you're kind of setting yourself up for success because
Nothing
because
wrong with that.
yeah, well, no, I mean, but it makes sense that the crackling would mean good news because it happens far more often, and people, want good news.
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's another one. This I thought this one was funny. It's a love divination. People used to believe that sparks flying from the fireplace meant that the lady in the house would receive a visit from a suitor.
I have to light my fire. So let's see, what else?
I think you were talking to me about chimney design in the United States.
Yes, there is a very interesting thing called a witch's bend.
Uh,
And the witch's bend was very common around the mid 1800s in construction at that time. And it mostly focused on the Northeast United States.
uh-huh.
And what it is at the top of the chimney, it's a tilt or a lean toward the top of the chimney outside. And that was so a witch couldn't fly in. And it's very interesting because a lot of times a tilt or a lean in your chimney means that you're having structural problems. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, so you've got two issues when you see one of these. Either you have structural issues in your chimney, or you're seeing a very cool piece of history. Um,
Uh-huh.
and so back to what we were saying about that being a magical entrance. You didn't want the witch to fly in, but also I think that there is a lot of luck, and even to this day in the UK, chimney sweeps are seen as good luck. They would invite them to weddings, and that makes sense to me too as a superstition, because the value that the chimney sweep brought was amazing. Cleaning out the chimney means that it's safe again and not going to have any fire up in the soot and all of that.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard job. It's a difficult, dirty job. And so I think that it's awesome that chimney sweeps are considered good luck, because those guys work.
I also expect that it's similar to a blacksmith where, yes, their actual work is very valued, but they're so rife with spiritual connotation as well, that just the fact that kind of like how a herbalist maybe or a midwife, right? Like they
Right.
provide services for the community that are very valuable, but there is an aura of spiritual magic around them. And I
Right.
see that in chimney sweeps as well. I wish we had more of them, I guess. We
Yeah.
sweep our own chimney, but so maybe I'm a chimney sweep sometimes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't have a wood burning fireplace, but I did in my last house, and they're hard to find. And there's also other superstition is around weather forecasts, right?
Yeah, that's right. Let me see. Yeah, people looked at how the draft was coming into the fireplace or the wood stove, color of the fire to predict what the weather would do in the future. I don't actually have any specific examples of that, nor do I have a lot of my own experience with that. I should pay more attention.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that, again, we look for symbolism in everything around us, and particularly in things that are important to us, like fire.
Right.
So I think that it makes sense. And the color, the fire color, the only thing I know about fire color is that if my gas stove has orange flame instead of blue, it's bad because there's oxygen getting in.
Yep.
So it means there's a leak somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. So maybe we can move on to there's also a lot of deities and spirits connected to the hearth.
Yeah, we touched a little on the domovoi earlier
Uh-huh.
and how they reside around the hearth.
Yes.
And what I found about that is that they are a useful household spirit,
Yep.
right? But they're very easily offended, and you have to give them gifts. And something common was a small cloak buried beneath the floor of the house to give them something to wear, or maybe leftovers from
Uh-huh.
dinner. But this is my favorite part. On March 30th of each year, they turn malicious from dawn until midnight, and they have to be bribed with food like little cakes and pots of stewed grain. so so it's reminded me of Gremlins,
Yeah, for
right?
real. Do we know
don't get
why
don't get them
do we
wet.
know why March 30th?
No, I don't. That's just the date that they get
Yeah.
evil.
So funny. I now really very much want to make a little cloak and put it beneath my stove. So creepy.
Yes, do
Yeah,
it. Definitely
yeah,
do.
so fun. So when we're talking about kitchen gods, goddesses, fire and stove and hearth gods and goddesses, there's a few that are clearly associated. We have Bridget in the Celtic countries. She's associated with the hearth in the home and domesticity, as well as smithcraft, also related to fire. And her protection is extended to the hearth and the well-being of the household. Often people will
Ah,
hang a Bridget's cross over their fire.
yes, I've seen those. I've tried to make them fairly unsuccessfully.
Then we have another Celtic one, which is, I have heard so many different ways of pronouncing it. I'm going to try with Cailleach. I've heard it many different ways, and I don't speak, I think it's Irish, Gaelic, I don't speak, or Scottish. She's associated with the winter and the preservation of seeds at that time. Her connection
Ah,
to the kitchen comes with the transformation of the harvest.
okay.
So you bring in the harvest and then you cook it in the kitchen.
Got it.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Ceridwen, that's a good one. She's a wealth harsh goddess. She's known as the keeper of the cauldron. Her main story is all about cooking up magic spells in a cauldron. And then we have Frigg, a Norse Germanic goddess, home, hearth, marriage, and fertility. So you find a lot of domestic gods associated with the hearth because back in the day, the two were pretty much one. House and hearth were the same thing, pretty much.
Uh,
Then we have from Germanic countries, we have Berchta. She's also known as Berchta, and she's also very much related to Valhalla. She is a winter goddess and very much concerned with the protection of women and children, spinning, a clean home, and the hearth fire. I found references to Loki as a household deity and hearth god. I don't know all that much about it. I'm super interested in finding out more than that.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because he's one of the first gods as opposed to goddesses that we've been talking about.
Uh-huh.
And it really makes sense to me as, a trickster
Uh-huh.
god that is comfortable with aspects of the feminine as the masculine.
Right.
And for so long, we've seen the hearth as sort of women's territory. And so I think that that's really fascinating that he's the first god that shows up.
Uh-huh.
But then we have Zhao Zhan,
Uh-huh.
who is a Chinese kitchen
Uh-huh.
god and also known as the stove god. And he's one of the most important of the Chinese domestic gods that protect the hearth and the family. And they believe that he originally resided in the stove and only later took on human form. And he's generally a god of the culinary arts, but his role really revolves, it's not as much protection of the home, but more of the morality and the conduct of the family.
Ah,
And so sort of like not a higher level deity, right?
right.
But one who was sent to the home to basically police the family and go back and report to the higher gods about whether or not this family's behavior was good. And I think it's funny because some of the ways that they make offerings, they take a paper representation of the stove god and they smear honey on the lips to sweeten
Uh-huh.
his words. And they also eat sweet cakes, all with that idea of sweetening his words when he reports back to the higher gods.
That's awesome. I think you see little shrines of to him in like Chinese restaurants often.
Yes, there are definitely and they put it up on a shelf.
Yeah, uh-huh. Yeah, that's very
Yep.
cool. In Russian folklore, when we talk about hearth spirits, they're usually connected to a family, not necessarily just to the house. So when a particular family moves, they would take coals from the old fireplace to light the fire in the new fireplace, and that was an invitation for the spirit to come back, to come with them.
So let's talk about some of the ways that this folk magic around the hearth that people actually did. The first one that comes to mind is how people sort of start off their new home.
Uh-huh.
And I think in a lot of ways it's, you light the hearth. And I found one example that in Chinese families, families are classified according to the stove they possess. And sometimes if it's a divided household, the kitchens are shared, but never the stove. And when a father, the patriarch of the family, dies, the sons will divide the father's household, and the eldest son always gets the stove. And then the younger brothers, they will transfer coals from the old stove to their own new stoves.
Wow.
So this is a way to invite the stove god to enjoy their newly formed household. And the process is called punchu, or dividing the stove. And it indicates the soul of the family and keeping the soul of the family and the fate of the family together.
Yeah, you see so many times household spirits and ancestors, and often considered the household spirit is considered the spirit of the person who started the family or started the homestead or the farm or something like that. And that seems like totally related, right? Like you still get your ancestors' fires. It's also interesting that in feng shui, there's so much emphasis on the stove, especially about good fortune and prosperity, I believe.
And back in the day, I mean, it was harder to start a fire. And so you had to, rather than just sort of stoking the coals from the night before, if your fire goes out overnight, then, you've got to go gather up the tinder and the kindling. And I'm sure that they were much better at this because if, they didn't have matches, so they were, better at starting fires that way. But it was still a lot more work, and it would be cold.
Yeah.
In a colder month. And so it makes a lot of sense to always keep that fire going, and why that would be an important practice.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I still don't like it when if it's cold and the fire goes out, you have to start it all the way from scratch. It's just a huge hassle.
Right. And you've gotten out of bed where you were warm, and then immediately it's this shock to your body, and it's cold, and then you got to do a bunch of work right away. And you don't have your tea yet.
Right. Now you're out in the snow in your slippers and a bathrobe getting more firewood. No, it's not great when your fire goes out.
Yes.
So we also talk about lighting a fire in the stove is associated with mastering a new home. And this is also, again, from Indo-European tradition. So you see it all over Europe, but all over most of the world, where maybe the language would be a little different in less patriarchal societies. But in the Indo-European practices of possessing, like this is, you start this fire, you now possess this land or this house, this area, this is now yours.
Well, you wouldn't really want from whoever was living there before, you wouldn't want to continue on their fire, because that's the soul of their family, or that's and so that to me is possession is a word that makes a lot of sense, because you want to make the place your own.
Exactly. Yeah. There's also tradition surrounding offering the first bite of food or the last sheaf of grain of the harvest to the fire. So there's a long tradition of honoring the fire as its own entity, really, and which is shown. And also, you shouldn't swear or have arguments in the presence of the stove. You should treat it with respect, like you wouldn't have an argument in front of an elder.
Right.
Just like that.
And that goes back to what we're saying about, food is love, and the kitchen is a place to share good times, because if you're fighting in there, it almost seems like, you know that when there's a lot of fighting going on in a house, that there are, underlying relationship issues. And to fight in the kitchen would be pretty powerfully bad.
Yeah. You can also ask the spirit of the fire for assistance, and you can make an offering. So like I would do that. Like I would make an offering when I was asking for assistance. I also know quite a few people, and I do it myself sometimes, who sing to the fire, especially when you're starting it. And that, like, I know the story of a woman. She lived in a cabin by herself. They only had a wood stove, and then her boyfriend moved in, And she had always made the fire because she lived by herself. So we would get up in the morning and she'd sing to the fire. And then her boyfriend was like, no, let me do that. You stay in bed and I will just get up and I'll make the fire for you. And it's always so hard for him to make the fire. And it's like so frustrating. And then one day, he's sleeping in or he's not feeling well or so. And it's like a 1-room cabin, I think. And she gets up and she sings to the fire and it's like a snap, right? It's so easy. The fire just comes and he was like, what? How do you do that? And she's like, yeah, I think it's the singing. And so then he started singing and he never had trouble with the fire again.
Oh, wow. That kind of gave me chills.
Yeah, it's so the best, right?
Now, we did talk about magic around the fireplace. We talked about good luck symbols drawn on the chimney or near across from the stove or the hearth.
Uh-huh.
I also found something called spiritual middens, and middens are a collection of things that are broken or used up that go in a void in the wall near the hearth. And it gets added to over time. It's been theorized that it could be spirit traps,
Uh-huh.
because they're playing with the broken
Yeah.
pieces and the whatever things are in there, because it's typically rather difficult to get to it, to put stuff in it.
Strange.
So it's like, yeah, it's a big deal to add more stuff. But that's what you do when something can't be salvaged or reused or in some way repurposed. They used to do that as well.
That is interesting. I've never even heard of this. And now I want to go look it up because that is fascinating to me. Is that mostly a British thing?
It's in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look that up. So a lot of traditions also have an annual reset, or maybe even twice a year. You see the twice a year often in places where people practice transhumance, which is where the cows or sheep go up the mountain, like away from the village for the summer months, and often with the young men, and they come back again in the fall. There's often a reset of the fire the beginning or the end of that. We also see the reset of stoves on Christmas Eve. And I believe I've heard about it on Samhain, where everybody, you let the fire in your stove or everywhere burn down, and then you start a fire anew, sometimes from a coal from a specific fire, sometimes making fire, and the more primitive the better it seems to be. So if you know how to make a friction fire, sometimes people will start the new fire with friction. It's definitely a refresh of the it's a good time, obviously, to clean out your fireplace or your hearth and to give it a little extra attention, but to have awareness of like how important this is and marking special occasions.
That's fascinating, because so much of the lore that we've been talking about is around maintaining the fire and not letting it go out. And so to put it out, that's really fascinating that you'd intentionally do that as a practice. And it makes sense that it only happens once or twice a
Right.
year, because again, all the reasons that we talked
Yep.
about. It occurs to me that it's very interesting that we haven't talked about one bit of folklore around like fireplace dampers.
Ah.
And I found, yeah, nothing. And, like with you have the fire going all the time. And that was originally, they would have that year round, the fire going all the time. And so you'd not have much of a need for that,
Uh-huh.
right? But, now, of course, we have fireplace dampers. And you'd think, even thinking back to the witch's bend, right? It's like, why don't you just close the damper?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, we do have a damper and we do close it when the fire is really hot and the secondary combustion comes in. So it does get closed. But yeah, I also I mean, I imagine that they didn't really have dampers
Right, right,
till the last couple of 100 years at least.
right.
I mean, I lived in a house with a wood stove that didn't have a damper. It was kind of a nightmare, but that stove wasn't that old, you know what I mean?
Right,
So,
right.
um, yeah, not a very ancient piece of equipment, I
Right.
think.
But we come up with new superstitions all the time. And
Yeah,
and
true.
and it's tied to new technology sometimes, right?
Yeah,
So
for sure.
yeah,
For sure.
yeah, definitely. And interesting that it was just lacking.
Yeah, I also haven't been able to find any of it. I did find things about the chimney hook, which is in a not in a wood stove, in an open fireplace. It's the hook that you would hang your big cauldron of soup on, and it was considered maybe not a spirit of itself, but the dwelling place of a spirit. So you, as you stir your soup, you would pour a little ladle over the chimney hook for the spirit of the hearth.
Interesting. See,
Yeah.
the fire pit that I've got right now has a cooking surface for it. And I did learn the reason I have this one is because I ruined my last fire pit by leaving the ashes in it. And when you leave the ashes in it, they draw in moisture. And
Yeah.
so I like rusted out the bottom of it. But now I'm gonna have to try that. And that'll be my version of the chimney hook.
Oh, fun. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Tracy, did you have any other hearth and stove and oven folklore to share with us?
No, I think it's just important to, remember the sort of reciprocal nature of people and fire and the importance of having that in your home and thinking about what the kitchen means to you and what the act of cooking means to you and how it's in a lot of ways considered sort of the center of the home. And think about it, even if you don't have an actual hearth, the stove can serve that purpose for you as well. The oven and the stove can serve that.
100%. Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.